second September meeting for Transportation Planning and Environment Committee. As you know, this is a kind of a carryover of the last committee meeting because we had a couple items on the agenda last time that we really didn't feel like we had the opportunity to ask enough questions about and get our answers addressed. So we've got a full meeting today, 10:30 to 1:30, and I'm going to get started right away with introductions. I'll start with the committee members here and then online. I'm Julie Eisel, committee chair.
Morgan Eggleston, committee vice chair.
Ed Driggs, committee member. Matt Newton, committee member.
Okay, and if we could go around the room and just introduce yourselves.
Allison Craig, Deputy Planning Director.
Kyle Joba, Planning Director, Manager's Office.
Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
Mike Davis, Charlotte Stormwater Services.
Daryl, Stormwater Services.
And who do we have online? Any staff members?
Hi, Grant Miyachi, Planning Department.
Alan Goodwin, Planning Department. Henry Kunzig, Urban Forestry.
This is Ed McKinney and Liz Baxton with CDOT.
Okay, thanks. And we just had Mr. Winston walk in. So if you want to introduce yourself, Mr. Winston.
Braxton Winston, committee member.
Great. With that, we're going to jump right into the continuation of the update from the Unified Development Ordinance. And I believe that council members had the opportunity to submit their questions on the UDO. And so I'm going to turn this over to Allison Craig, and it says Laura. Is Laura online, or are you going to just take it over? Allison?
Yeah, I'll start. Laura's online, and I think she's having trouble unmuting. If so,
okay,
someone can work on that. So we appreciate the opportunity to come back before council committee to talk about the UDO. The draft is expected to come out the week of October 4th. And so we appreciate the opportunity to take a deeper dive into some of the new concepts. In council packets, you should have a copy of the presentation that we gave to you on August the 23rd. And I wanted to recap just a couple new concepts that we touched on during that meeting, because I think they'll be of interest to you and to the community. And we have staff that is online and in person here to be able to answer questions on those. And so starting first with the subdivision, streets, and infrastructure, some of the new concepts that we're proposing in the UDO will be to apply street connectivity for all development and not just for new subdivisions, as well as standards and thresholds for cross-access drives. There'll be increased flexibility in the streetscape standards, as well as applying a 6-foot minimum sidewalk throughout the community. Some of the other important concepts are planning for future street needs, looking at how we apply new curb construction, making sure we have adequate street infrastructure, protecting right-of-way widths for future multimodal street investment. And some of the new ideas too that started with TOD as looking at transportation impact studies being applied consistently throughout development and not just in by right and rezoning situations, as well as incentivizing TDM, transportation demand management in more situations and more development. And we've got Ed McKinney and Liz Babson online to be able to answer questions on those. I know there's been a lot of questions about stormwater. I think that was one of the questions that was submitted to staff to address today, and I know it came up in the rezoning meeting. And so really looking at being able to better protect from flooding, particularly in our infill and smaller developments. And we've got Mike and Daryl here in the room to be able to answer questions on those. Wanting to really better protect our natural resources going forward. So looking at protecting native trees of 30 inches or higher, as well as starting to address canopy loss that's occurring in our infill and single family developments. We also want to recognize that there are not every site is unique, and wanting to allow for greater flexibility and options in meeting the tree canopy goals in development. And Henry is online to help answer questions on those. And before we go into answering questions, I wanted to take a couple minutes to go through two new things for council committee that I think is important for you all to be aware of before the draft comes out in October. And the first is taking a little bit deeper dive into the residential character overlays that are being proposed as part of the UDO. And then secondly, we've got a new approach to parking, a tiered approach that has a combination of parking minimums and parking maximums, depending on the zoning district. And so wanted to turn this over to Laura to walk through this quickly, and then we can move into the question and answer. But I wanted to make sure that y'all had this information before the draft comes out in October. So if Laura is online, I can advance the slides for you, Laura.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. So we do have some overlay districts that deal with different council objectives. And the first is the neighborhood character overlay district is one of the items that we will have in the forthcoming UDO, designed to preserve the existing character of a neighborhood and would be applied neighborhood by neighborhood, available for our lower density zoning districts. And it would apply to all residential construction changes, expansion, alterations, and want to talk a little bit more about how this would work. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So this would be applied with by the neighbors requesting it, and it would start with a process to develop a plan that a majority of the neighbors would ask for, and would come to council and ask for the plan, or the planning department ask for the plan, council to ask to apply the neighborhood conservation overlay. And the goals are to create a consistency in scale in a neighborhood, or maintain a consistency in scale, proportion, and rhythm, and similarity in the way that on-site elements like vehicle parking, landscaping, trees, and accessory structures are addressed with regulations. So it would create unique regulations for the elements that the neighborhood wanted to pursue. In addition to that, there are some standards, a minimum of 1 block face. These would be neighborhoods that have been established at least 25 years. A minimum of 75% of the lots in the overlay area developed, and would not be in addition to the historic district overlay. It would be another option that neighborhoods could use. And so again, it would look at creating a plan initially that had new zoning standards for neighborhoods. That would be, we would work with the neighborhood on what they wanted, creating that character plan that could deal with lot area, lot width, your setbacks, your maximum height, building coverage, amount of surface parking, trees, tree planting, and it would be based on the existing character of the neighborhood. So not intended to change the character, but to maintain the character that we have now. This is a tool that is used extensively in North Carolina and a number of other communities, and it will be our first foray into this. I think the other thing important for people to know, for council members and others to know, is that the uses in the underlying zoning districts could not be changed with the neighborhood character. So it would not deal with uses, it would just deal with what is the feel of the character, where are the buildings placed, what are the heights and so forth, to be able to maintain that character. And it would be tailored to each neighborhood. So the process to do this is there would be the request from the neighborhood to develop the neighborhood character plan. Eligibility would be determined. There'd be a public info meeting to discuss with the neighborhood. And then if the neighborhood wanted to pursue it, and as there are resources, depending on the demand for this, there would be the development of that neighborhood character plan, with staff working very closely with the neighborhood and assessing the current characteristics and which ones which of the current characteristics should be copied or put into zoning that is special for that neighborhood. After the plan is done, that does not mean the overlay would be applied. The next step is to see if with that plan, the neighborhood would like to apply then the character plan. And if so, there would be a petition that comes to city council and you guys would decide if the overlay district should be applied to that neighborhood. So ultimately it becomes council decision. And then we also have a residential infill overlay, which is a little bit more prescriptive, but it is, so it's not as neighborhood specific, but does have some additional standards that a neighborhood pursue for their neighborhood. And this one is all the standards or none of them. It's really to facilitate infill development in our neighborhood one place type and to maintain character again in those areas. So complement the existing pattern and scale and controls height and dwelling size. We'd want to have at least 50 contiguous lots and could be initiated by either a majority vote of council if you all thought this is a neighborhood that really needs a residential infill overlay, or 60% of property owners within the designated area. And this would also be applied to our neighborhood one zoning districts. And just to give you context, currently those are R3, R4, R5, R6, R8. So those are the types of areas, our current neighborhoods where this would be applied. So I won't get into all the details, but I'd be glad to ask questions. We do limit height based on the height of the neighbors next door on either side of a new residential structure or in addition to it. So you would be limited in height or guided, your maximum height would be guided by the height of properties on either side of you. And in addition, we'd be looking at maximum building size, so that in a lot of our in-town neighborhoods have homes that may be 12, 14, 1,500 square feet. And this is really designed so that the other homes that come into the neighborhood are of comparable size. We have put a caveat in here that allows existing homes or an allowance for existing homes to be expanded, so that we're not prohibiting that, but we want to make sure that, again, everything remains in character with what's there. And we also have an allowance so that we make sure there is enough size so that a duplex or triplex could be built. So we're again not prohibiting uses. We're really focusing on character and maintaining character, but this is more of a standard approach as opposed to the character overlay, which is tailored to the neighborhoods, but will take a little bit longer to put in place. We also have a mixed income residential that would be voluntary, but would allow an increase in your development intensity in exchange for adding affordable and market rate housing units. We have this, as you all know, something similar to this in our ordinance now. Unfortunately, it hasn't had the success that we have anticipated originally when it was put in place or wanted. What we have done is made some changes, eliminated geographic limitations on where this could go, and hope we have something that will better align with the market demand than what we have on the books now. But again, you get a slightly larger number of lots in order. With that, you actually then provide 50% of your additional units at 80% of the area median income or less. So,
Laura, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you for a second and go back to the district overlays. Mr. Eggleston has a question.
Certainly.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to get to this before we get into parking, which is a whole separate discussion. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So my questions are about the NCO. On the residential infill, it says 60% of property owners. I don't see anything on the NCO. Does that indicate that an NCO application would have to have the support of every impacted homeowner?
No, and I'm going to apologize. I don't remember the exact number. I believe it's 50%, but we can follow up and give that to you. So no, it would also need neighborhood support to pursue that process.
Okay, and just as an example, I'm picturing a lot of interest around this in NODA, a neighborhood that doesn't have a designated historic district, but does have a lot of historic structures in its built environment. If we're talking about doing this block by block, and obviously as you go through NODA, there are blocks that have much larger new single family homes, and there's blocks that are still primarily the old mill homes and craftsman style bungalows. If this becomes a checkerboard in a neighborhood like NODA, where one block qualifies, the next block doesn't, the next block does, would we attempt to tackle each block individually as the city, or would we look to try to create standards that were uniform for NODA, which I think yields a more consistent outcome in the way things develop, but B, if you're trying to tackle this block by block and 18 separate blocks in NODA that are not contiguous want to do this, and you're trying to take each one of these through this 7-step process individually and create different standards for each of those 18 blocks, I think it becomes completely unwieldy. So I don't know if that's been considered, but I think there are probably dozens of neighborhoods like NODA where it could be a checkerboard of applicability. Is that a word?
Yes.
And so I think we need to try to take those, we need to try to figure out who in certain neighborhoods this can apply to and is interested, and then tackle it as a neighborhood so that there's consistency and that you're not doing the same thing 18 times for one neighborhood.
Thank you. I think that's a really good point. And I think as we've been thinking about this, what we've seen in other communities is it is a larger neighborhood. And I think we would want to reach out if part of the neighborhood comes in to the larger neighborhood to see if they're interested at the same time. I think we certainly agree with you. We could have, part A of a neighborhood and part B that has slightly different standards. But yes, we don't want to do this block by block incrementally. We'd like to do it neighborhood by neighborhood.
And I believe that there's going to be so much interest in this in every part of the city that it's going to have to be someone's job, I think, to literally just do, at least for a period of a couple of years. I think everyone who believes that their block or their couple of blocks might be eligible is going to want to do this. I'm okay with that. I just think it is going to be something we get a lot of adoption around. So I hope that we're prepared and have the bandwidth to accommodate the requests that I believe are inevitable.
Certainly, and we would probably want to, I'm sorry if I spoke over you, we would, if we have that issue, we'll probably want to work with you guys to say, what is our priority? How do we want to prioritize these neighborhoods?
Yeah, that's what I was
also-
going to say also, Laura. So, but I was going to quickly add to that, and Laura, you can confirm this or not, but in other communities, and Raleigh comes to mind where this has been done, it doesn't typically happen that way in terms of implementation. Well, that's something we definitely will look into.
It doesn't happen which
With a
way.
lot of people coming, I think they've had it for 20 years, and I think in that space, they probably have had less than 10 applications.
10 qualifying applications or 10 applications,
10
period?
qualifying applications. Yeah.
Where it's
Again,
going to
it does
apply.
depend.
Yeah, I mean, and I would be curious how many applications they vetted and determined were not eligible, but
That's the criteria is key.
yeah, I'll be shocked if there aren't lots of applications. That doesn't mean in every case it'll be applicable, but I mean, I've already got people, and we haven't even implemented this. So I already have multiple neighborhoods asking about, well, tell me more about these character overlays, because we're going to want to do that. So everybody at least initially thinks they're going to want to do it. They might start to look at this and determine that they're not eligible, but or you might determine that they're not eligible, but I think there's going to be a lot of people asking.
Certainly.
Excuse me,
I-
Mr. Newton has a question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I agree with Councilmember Eggleston that I think we're going to see a high volume of applications. Now, whether or not they're eligible, I don't know either, but I suspect the same. My question, so I think we were just mentioning or just talking about maybe the smallest denominator here, which is block by block. I'm wondering how large or what's the scope of what we define to be a neighborhood. Oakhurst comes to mind in my district, where we could look at, I guess, what we kind of conventionally believe the neighborhood to be, which is much smaller than what some plat maps would suggest, which would have it extending almost into Cotswold, frankly. So how do we define the scope or the parameters of what a neighborhood is? That's my first question. And I also want to ask about design and building specs, or I suppose kind of the limitations on what we consider to be neighborhood character, because when I was looking at a previous slide, it seemed to be a lot of limitations on design and building specifications. But I think, I suspect that we're probably going to receive some applications that whose intent is to limit unit number per lot. And I'm wondering if that is something that is also applicable here in this idea of what constitutes neighborhood character.
Thank you. Great questions. So let me answer the second one first. You could not, as this is written, limit unit number with a character overlay. You can limit quantitative things, because we have some state enabling legislation limitations on what we can touch with respect to design. We can deal with lot sizes, lot width, setbacks, house width. We're working on something with trees where there's a predominant character, all based on the predominant character of an area. But we have not written this in to limit, as it's written now, to limit number of units on a lot or uses on a lot.
Sorry to interrupt, but just so I'm clear, so this is not something that could be used by a neighborhood to, for example, limit the number of duplexes within the neighborhood.
That's right. It's not written to do that.
Okay. And then, my first question was about how do we define the scope of what is a neighborhood? I mean, once again, there are areas where we could have swaths of trees that are still considered within a neighborhood, frankly, creating character there. So on a larger scale, outside of just this block by block approach, how large could a neighborhood be? How do we define the parameters or the boundaries of a neighborhood?
So another great question. We haven't put a limitation on neighborhood size, but I think what will probably limit it, and if we really end up like it's very large and we need to do this in a couple of pieces, we can do that. But Alan Goodwin, who's on, I'm sorry, I noticed my camera's not working. Apologize for that. You have to have 51% of the owners of the land area and 51% of the owners of lots with. So that will probably be somewhat self-limiting as we deal with this. So that will probably be, reduce the area where this is applied, because you do have to meet that criteria. On the other hand, I think if we do end up with really large areas with that many people, we're going to have to see, is there common character in all these areas, and go through the criteria and see if all of it qualifies. And if it really seems to be like, this is too large of an area to do in one plan, we need to split it up, we may recommend doing that.
And so what I gather, Laura, is that we're talking about existing communities here, right? We're not talking about any areas that are undeveloped, right, being somewhat or potentially being included in what maybe existing community would consider to be its neighborhood, right? So I mean, it's just those existing kind of pre-existing neighborhoods that are built, the buildings within it, and that's kind of setting the parameters.
Yes, and it would also, if there are vacant infill lots in an established neighborhood, it would apply to that as well as redeveloped in there. But if there's a large vacant piece of land or the neighborhoods are very recent, this wouldn't apply. You wouldn't be able to apply for this. We're really looking at neighborhoods that have been established for at least 25 years.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Driggs has a question.
Actually, a couple, Madam Chair. First of all, comment, I really appreciate these provisions. I think they make our plan a little more adaptable. They give us a means of avoiding unintended consequences from 2.1. So I'm very encouraged and interested in these. I think, among other things, these provisions could provide a useful tool for the anti-displacement group to actually achieve its mission of protecting vulnerable neighborhoods, because they could promote the designation of those neighborhoods and thereby, excuse me, reduce the risk of inappropriate development there that could work to the disadvantage of people who live there. But there are also neighborhoods in my district, which does consist of more than just Ballantyne. So Park Ridge, for example, and Raintree are mature neighborhoods where I think we might want to look at this. So I think this could prove very useful, because there are certainly places, for example, where trying to achieve the goal of 10-minute walkable neighborhoods would be very disruptive to the existing community. And perhaps we have a means by doing this of avoiding that. I'm curious to know, if we talk about 25-year-old neighborhoods, I'm a little curious about that particular requirement. For one, because there has been large-scale development that was pretty comprehensive and created a neighborhood character in fewer than 25 years ago. And so I'm not sure that cutoff will be entirely fair to some people who might live in 20-year-old neighborhoods or in neighborhoods that were developed, as is the case at Waverly, at Golf Links and Ray Farms and Ballantyne Reimagined. Now, I think Ballantyne Reimagined in particular will probably be pretty consistent with our 2040 plan. I'm not sure they will need to kind of seek any sort of protection. But so I just want to raise the question about the 25 years. I think we may need to talk about that some more. The other thing is, if you have a neighborhood like Raintree here, that's actually older than that. And the style of the homes there is kind of, I'd call it middle class, maybe a little less. So would we require that the further development be compatible with that, to the extent that people couldn't tear down houses, for example, and build large McMansions on those lots? Or how prescriptive would the NCO be in a case like that?
Thank you. Great question. Each neighborhood will decide what are the characteristics that they would want in their neighborhood character plan. So it could be the neighborhood says, what we really want to do is keep larger setbacks, but we're not concerned if large homes get built. Or we're really concerned about the size of the homes, but we're okay with the base district setback. But there's a menu that each neighborhood will have available to choose from on what things they think are important for maintaining their character.
So,
this is pretty neighborhood tailored.
Right, and I appreciate that. I think that's a great feature. But would state law, for example, prevent us from accommodating a request from neighbors that the price point of any new home construction be within a certain range? Because I know that on rezonings and things like that, we can't actually take that into account.
I am not an attorney, but I am 99% sure that state law would prohibit us from doing that.
Okay.
So we're not looking at price point in the character overlay.
I just want to understand that. I'm not expressing an opinion about it. Do you have a sense of, and this is a little bit further to the prior questions, of what percentage of our land area might ultimately be included in NCOs? I mean, what is your sense of just the magnitude of this particular provision?
I think as Ty said, as we've seen it in other communities, there has been demand for this, but it hasn't been every neighborhood, because a lot of neighborhoods have their community associations, their deed restrictions that manage these kind of things. So they may not be as interested. And you have to have enough members of the community, landowners, saying that they want this. So I think over time we might see maybe 20 or 30, but I could be wrong, and Councilmember Eggleston is thinking a much higher number. But from what we've seen in Raleigh and Greensboro and so forth, it hasn't been every neighborhood. And it's typically been in town neighborhoods, but we may see something very different here. And again, I think we're going to have to deal with kind of, we may, if we have that much demand, have to deal with how do we prioritize going through this process with the neighborhoods.
Right. I just wanted to get a sense, again, in defining these things of, you know, what you would consider an acceptable volume of applications and when you would think that maybe we need to prioritize. But I'll accept your answer. That's fine. And Madam Chair, if I may, just quickly, on the infill side, certainly in my district, and I think this is true everywhere, the circumstances of infills vary a lot. It depends on what's next door and so on. Usually, typically in my district, it's an R3 type of zone property that really isn't suitable for single family. And you might get small commercial development there, retail, something like that. But it varies a lot case to case. So can we craft an infill kind of characteristic? You propose some dimensions for this thing, but can we really craft something where one size fits all? And by the way, I'm grateful that we're dealing with this because the infills have been kind of random. We've made exceptions to our R3 zoning in all kinds of circumstances. But how do we rationalize that process and create a workable set of rules that isn't too limiting given the variety of situations?
I think that's a really good question, and I am pondering it. I think it's going to be typically there has to be a predominant character for it to be eligible for a character overlay. And it may be that the characteristics vary by different blocks.
That question was about infill. I was talking about infill, right?
Right, but we would consider this to apply to infill as well in those neighborhoods.
Okay.
So it wouldn't just be the existing homes, but infill development or redevelopment would be subject to the character overlay standards.
But that might include, say, non-residential uses on little patches of land that say we're on main roads. I've had a couple of things, for example, in Providence Road, where you had an unusable patch of land for residential purposes, and it was proposed for childcare or whatever. So I'll just make the comment, Laura. I don't really need an answer, but I'm saying we need to be prepared for the variety of situations, which you know all too well, that can arise when you're talking about infill, because those little patches of land can be difficult, frankly, and not conform to what we're trying to accomplish around them. Last brief comment, the density bonus, as you know, the density bonus hasn't worked. So I hope that as we develop this further, we will engage in discussions and negotiations with developers who have expressed an interest in being involved in creating affordable housing, but they haven't seen anything from us yet that works for them commercially. So even though we don't want to be overly accommodating to them, if we don't have something that induces them to do what we want, then it's not going to work. And therefore, I would just recommend that we really negotiate with them in advance to find out what they would actually avail themselves of. And thank you, Madam Chair. That's my comment.
Thank you, Mr. Driggs. Mr. Winston has a question.
I think it's more of a comment, and it's something that Mr. Driggs brought up.
the additional eligibility of NCOs, neighborhood character overlay districts, of being established for 25 years. I would remind staff and I remind neighborhood leaders, right? This is a plan that is supposed to be implemented over a generation, right? So we might be looking about how this is going to affect the rush of neighborhoods right now. But we will have neighborhoods that will be coming online, over these next 20 or so years. I think of, for instance, the area known as South End, right? It didn't exist 25 years in the regards that it is now. Look at new emerging neighborhoods that encroach on old neighborhoods like Loso. If you go a little further south, this is an opportunity, right? I know neighborhoods and definitions of neighborhoods and characteristics of neighborhoods are something that is obviously very important to our constituents. This is something that we heard a lot about coming from all sides during the process. But I think the message to community leaders and neighborhood members, and as new people continue to grow and our neighborhoods continue to change, is that neighbors have the opportunity to define what their neighborhood character actually is. So by this definition, for instance, South End's character, neighborhood character, cannot be defined yet, right? Although we might anecdotally think that it has a certain character. Some may say that that character needs to change, right? I don't know exactly, again, I don't necessarily have a question here, but I guess if there is a question, it's for us as an organization. How do we think about working with neighborhoods and neighbors to proactively create a process that does define that neighborhood character, right? So that as we are implementing this, not just in these next 2 years, but in the year 2037, for instance, the neighborhoods can look back and say, hey, we were doing the intentional work to define some of these things so we can manage future growth and create neighborhoods that are sustainable and perpetuated throughout time under the guidance of these implementations that we're doing. So I don't know how we do that. As Mr. Eggleston said, maybe there's going to have to be somebody that manages that immediate process, but who is going to be thinking about that long term and working with neighborhoods that over the years do, have the ability where other neighborhoods don't, to define what their neighborhood character is going to become, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Mr. Winston. And I'll just offer a quick observation as someone who lives in a district that has an overlay. Not everybody wants that. So I like the fact that there's the immediate burden is on the neighborhood to get enough people together to ask for it. I think that's going to be tough to do, honestly, because people want to move. They want to know they can sell their house. They want to know they can modify their house. And, on the front of the issue, it looks like this is a great idea. It's going to have this great character, but I think it's going to be harder than people think to get 75 or 60% of a neighborhood to agree on what that character is and what people have to comply with, because everybody has different ideas of what they want their house to look like, and they don't want to limit the ability to sell it. So just an observation. But with that, we're going to move along to Laura. You were in the middle of the mixed income residential development. I don't know if you've finished that particular slide. You want to go on to vehicle parking standards, because I know we'll have a lot of questions about that as well.
Sure. So as we have re-looked at vehicle parking standards entirely within the UDO and want to present a new approach, and will be lots of perspectives. We're looking forward to hearing from you guys. So as we know, Charlotte developed really as an auto-oriented city. We don't need to go into that too much. We're trying to get more of a multimodal approach. And we know that this is a transition. So, today we're still pretty auto-oriented, some areas of town less so than others, but over time, in the timeframe of the 2040 plan and beyond, we really want to see that transition to less reliance on personal vehicles. So we have tried to align, and if we can go to the next slide, our parking standards to 3 different tiers of parking requirements, really based on the context that we anticipate for each of these areas. And so I wanted to just talk through the tiers so that you can understand them. And the first is the tier that is most like what we have now, though typically with a little bit less minimum parking. So we would have minimum off-street parking and no maximum parking limits. And these would be for, if we could go back just real quickly. Well, no, I'm sorry, keep going. Go back to the slide you were on. Yeah, this would be for our manufacturing and logistics, our industrial areas, our some of our less densely developed campuses, our mobile home parks, our neighborhood one place type districts, and our lower intensity multifamily. And so typical standards, we don't have to belabor this, but for single family, 2 spaces per unit, for other residential, 1 space per unit. And then for non-residential, usually 500 square feet per unit. But then we do have some uses that have very unique standards, but we have some baseline. So that is probably our most traditional tier. And the next tier is tier 2, where we would include both a minimum and a maximum for our off-street parking. So you would have to provide at least this many spaces, but no more than this many spaces. Maximum doesn't apply to parking structures, and this would be for our evolving urban districts. So our innovative mixed-use district, our intensely developed campuses, our neighborhood centers, our community activity center, the less intensely developed are commercial centers, and the most intense of our neighborhood 2 or our higher density residential. Again, we have a minimum here of 1 space per unit, a maximum of 1 space per bedroom, and some typical minimums and maximums for non-residential. So this is similar to what we have maybe used in our PED overlay over time, where you have both a minimum and a maximum. And then our third tier is our maybe most aggressive, and this is based on our new TOD approach that we use for parking. And this is where we almost always only have maximum off-street parking and no minimum, with a couple of caveats. But we're really focusing on maximums and not minimums. So that would be for our more intensely developed community activity centers, our regional activity centers, our transit-oriented development districts, and our urban core, currently UMUD, and outside of the freeway loop, that immediate area is where we would look at applying this. And expanding on, again, on what we've done with Todd. We just have a minimum for, are proposing a minimum for a few uses. One is what we have in Todd, live performance venues, nightclubs, restaurants, and so forth, but only when they're within 200 feet of a neighborhood 1 place type. And then also looking at adding, because we have had some concerns brought to us about when you're within 200 feet of a neighborhood 1 place type, that multifamily should have some level of minimum because of the potential overflow of parking on the streets in those established neighborhoods. But for a very small area, we'd be looking at minimums. And the ability also to reduce the minimum if you can show that you are handling parking otherwise. Maybe you have a specific strategy for your site that says we're not going to allow people to own cars, like we've seen on a rezoning recently, or in an area with the city parking permit program. We then would have maximums of 1 space per bedroom for residential, and then fairly low, well, relatively low compared to the others, maximum for non-residential. So again, just to sum up, a 3-tiered approach based on the context we expect in each of these areas and how quickly they're transitioning to being less auto-oriented. And just want to leave you guys with, this is our kind of first thought on this. We're interested in hearing your feedback, and also what we might adopt initially could evolve over time and could be adjusted as our community continues to change. And I believe that's my last slide. So, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Winston has a question.
I was wondering if before the questions, we can quickly just translate those.
Hey, Laurie, I
Yes,
think we need a
please.
legend probably next time, but maybe we
Yes.
can kind of skim through those really quickly.
Sure. So the tier 1, ML1 and ML2 are our manufacturing logistics or industrial districts. So the IC1 is a larger suburban campus. It could be educational. It could be, I don't want to take too long on this, a medical campus. The OFC is office flex campus. So those would be more business parks. MHP manufactured housing. N1 are those neighborhood 1 districts, all of our neighborhood 1 districts for that place type. And N2, A, and B are our less intensely developed townhome and multifamily districts. So for tier 2, innovative mixed use, our intensely developed campus districts, IC2, our neighborhood centers, our community activity center, CAC1, the less intense version of that. CG and C are our commercial districts, which are really frankly more auto-oriented. Think auto dealerships, big boxes and so forth that people would still, at least in the near term, be driving to. And then into C is our most intensely developed multifamily district. And then tier 3, where we would only have parking maximums in almost all cases, is the more intensely developed community activity center. Our regional activity centers, think South Park, as an example, our transit-oriented development districts, our UC, which is the district that we're proposing would replace UMUD. So Uptown, and UE is urban edge, so that would be around the edge of Uptown.
Job, I think one question that is going to come from me, but why is staff and the UDO committee recommending any parking minimums, period, to us to codify in our code?
Why don't you start, Laura, and I'll supplement.
Thank you. I was trying to see if someone else wanted to take this. Because we really think our community is transitioning, and that we have heard both sides of this perspective. We've had some people that are saying we need more parking, and others are saying we need less. We've tried to find a middle ground, but again, we're very interested in seeing kind of where council lands on this. We can certainly make adjustments, but we do think we're really at the early stages of a transition to a community where much less parking is required and where people are going to be less using cars less, and there can be some secondary impacts on other properties if in some areas we don't have any parking. Again, we're really interested in hearing council's perspective and the community's perspective on this.
A follow-up question: what do you mean? One, what do you mean by secondary effects on other properties? And two, again, I still don't understand. Even with I hear what the philosophy is, but what I also hear is, if the market decides projects and products need parking, then the market will supply that. That's what people, that's what people will build to sell their product. Why, I don't understand why we have to mandate the creation of certain types of parking on people's land if that's not what they want to do, and that's not what their market will respond to not having that. So those are two questions. What do you mean by the secondary effects on other properties? And why are we thinking of codifying a certain market response in our comprehensive policy?
Sure. So secondary effects, let me hit that one. I think that's probably easiest is you may have a neighborhood that is very dependent upon on-street parking. Just at the time that they were built, they didn't have driveways and off-street parking. And so some of those folks are used to parking in front of their house. New development that comes in near them could then start having spillover. If there's an allowance for parking on the street, taking up all of the parking and there not being enough on-street parking for everyone. So that was really my thought with secondary impacts. You could have people starting to park in their next door neighbors' parking lots because not enough parking was provided on their site. Why we took this approach is we followed the comprehensive plan guidance that talked about reducing parking. And that's really what we've tried to do is to reduce the parking. Again, I think ultimately, if we get different guidance from council and there's a change in that, we have the flexibility. We're just at the beginning process of the UDO to make these adjustments, but we're really wanting to hear kind of what are the perspectives and we will adjust as appropriate throughout the process.
Thank you. That's my last comment and request. I think it's important for us to remember and for us to state to our citizens that individual citizens do not own the public investment, i.e. The streets, curbs, and sidewalks that are public. Even though the status quo might make some people in some neighborhoods feel that way, that is not in fact the truth. I would like to see a UDO option that does not have any parking minimums in it. Thank you.
I just want to comment on the secondary impact because I think, there are, I can think of the Central Coffee on Central Avenue. They've got a few parking spots, and it used to be before some of those apartments were built that their customer base, a lot of folks, myself included, would park on the street. Now, if you had one of those apartment buildings that were built and it took advantage of the fact that there's no parking minimum and nobody had a parking spot in those apartments, they're all going to be on the street. And that particular restaurant, vendor, whatever retail spot really only has 2 or 3 parking spots now. There are restaurants and bars that don't have any parking right now that rely on the street. And I can think of one situation where a by right building is going to go up because it's TOD and it won't have any parking. And I'll be surprised if that business stays in business because their patrons won't have anywhere to park at all. And that could end up forcing that business out of there. And I'm not sure who would want to start a business in there again, if in fact it's very well known that there's nowhere to park. So I think it's a dynamic conversation that we have to have, and we have to be willing to adjust to it. So I almost wonder if there's a way to say, there's a measure in a particular area. And we talked about this on Cleveland, and we approved that rezoning TOD conditional because it had gotten to a saturation point where too many of the restaurants and businesses there did not have any parking. And to add another building like that with no parking at all hit a point of saturation. So I don't know if there's a way to measure that, to say, okay, you can have no parking unless we hit a certain amount of density where there's too much no parking development in the area. Just a thought.
Again, I think you're illuminating a point, Mayor Pro Tem, of us trying to create policy to guide the market. When you're dealing with businesses and business models in a growing city, folks do have to adjust, and some folks are going to adjust, and some aren't. So if the market is going to provide for less intense parking structures, and people are going to want to buy and live and work and play there, then so be it. We can't try to pick those winners and losers over the next 20 years. I mean, it's seen in many dense urban areas that business models adjust or they don't, you know. I'd say the opposite can be true. There's a certain business model that really does rely on the auto-centric parking lot a model, right? Chick-fil-A. And it creates so many ancillary dangers because of that, whether it's the one on Sharon Amity and Randolph, or the one that was on Woodlawn, or really anywhere you go. But their market it relies on that, and it's going to be successful. I'm not saying that we should necessarily prohibit parking. I don't think anybody is saying prohibit parking. So again, if the market wants to respond in that way, they can and should do that. I just don't know why we would mandate for folks who think they have a market, why we would want to limit that here in the city of Charlotte as we continue to grow.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I'm thinking in particular of a neighborhood in Washington, D.C. that lost their restaurants because they had a couple great little neighborhood restaurants that had no parking. And when the parking situation got so bad, the neighborhood was able to put permitted parking on all of those streets. And so if you didn't live in the neighborhood and could park there because you had a permit, you couldn't go to that restaurant. And so from a quality of life standpoint, I do think it matters. I don't want to rely on the market because the market's going to do what works for them from a profit standpoint. And it's cheaper to build something with no parking. So to your point, everybody has the right to those streets, but if you build things that are going to cut other people out from using the streets as well, you don't have a balance. And that's my concern, is if we really want quality of life and we want different uses in our neighborhoods, then we have to have some flexibility about this a little bit. I don't know what the right number is. I agree with you. I struggle more with our uptown argument about parking than I do with neighborhood parking, because I think quality of life is important.
Last thing, and I know Mr. Eggleston is in line, I would just say, you mentioned something right here that the market is going to respond to by building things that are cheaper or cost less per unit. And that is the inherent problem that we're trying to solve here in Charlotte, is that the cost of moving dirt and building housing, business, we have regulations here that prevent different price points from coming to market. And I think we should take and I thought the goal was to find opportunity to provide a much wider diversity of price point. And so if the market is going to provide something at a lower price point because they don't have to provide those parking structures or those parking spaces, I think that's literally kind of what we're aiming to do, to bring options to the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Winston. I have Mr. Driggs and then Mr. Eggleston.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I would like to respond to my learned fellow economist. The market does not come up with efficient solutions, with fair solutions, when there are externalities. So if people build based on the assumption that they can spare themselves the cost of providing parking because people will park somewhere else where someone is parking now who lives nearby, that displacement effect is the reason that you need government intervention here, and you need to ensure that people pursuing profits are not poaching basically parking capacity either on street from people who are currently parking there, or in fact on other private properties. And we've all seen situations, for example, where I'm thinking now of Colony and Selwyn, The restaurant on the corner there, people park in the lot across the street. People park wherever they can find a place to put their car. So my general comment here is that as we regulate parking, we should attempt to sort of squeeze the availability of parking in such a way as to make alternatives to cars more attractive. And we should try to drive the process that way. But if we get too far ahead of reality in terms of how many people own cars, we are just going to create headaches. People having to drive around for 10 or 15 minutes and park 100 yards or 200 yards away from their destination. People parking on private property or in places that currently are occupied by residents who feel that they have a right to park near their house. And the other thing is that if we're too aggressive about limiting parking, you can bet that the cost to park in places like uptown is going to skyrocket. And that for people who need to park because they don't have a means of transportation is punitive. In a lot of cases, those people are not necessarily ones for whom that cost is inconsequential. So I think we need to start with reference to existing car ownership and demand patterns and kind of apply a squeeze with the numbers that we now create for the caps. We need to have some minimums for the reason that Ms. Harmon pointed out, and I believe the Mayor Pro Tem also understands, which is to avoid adverse effects for others as a result of decisions made by the market itself. And I'm as pro-market a guy as anybody, but one of the roles of government, in my mind, is to intervene in situations where the free enterprise economy is not properly reflecting all the costs and benefits of the activity of individuals. So I think we ought to have a metric that refers to the existing situation, and perhaps we ought to think about defining the metric in such a way that it can evolve over time in response to observed trends in car ownership and parking requirements, so that we don't try to put in place right now a long-term plan that locks in a number that could be too aggressive now and not aggressive enough in 10 years' time. And can we plan for that somehow even now? Obviously, we always have the opportunity to make changes later, but if the current document thinks in terms of our constantly trying to kind of squeeze the availability of parking to induce people to get out of their cars, then how will we kind of maintain that pressure going forward? Can we establish a reference that we would use? And the other thing I want to point out is if we don't have a transportation network that offers good alternatives, then I don't think it's fair to kind of make it harder to own a car. There are certain people in Charlotte today, in fact, I believe there are a lot of people in Charlotte today that could not reasonably get from where they are to where they need to go without a car. And in fact, I would be interested in seeing a map that shows our existing public transportation and the percentage of trips that people need to make that are covered reasonably by our existing public transportation. We know, for example, that the bus system as it exists now can require that somebody travels for 2 hours if they want to take a bus from where they live to where they work. And for someone like that, it's possible that having a car would enable them to make the same trip in about 30 minutes. So if we aren't realistic about the circumstances of the people that we're serving and who can reasonably leave their car at home or not own a car, and I think the discussion we had about that one property that was proposed not to have any parking, and I believe that may be the one, Mayor Pro Tem, that you alluded to, is a good case study for this. We had to think about whether people would really just not own cars who lived there, or whether they might basically try to circumvent the requirement that they not own cars and have the car registered in somebody else's name, park it further away. Ms. Harmon, I appreciate your thoughtfulness on this subject. I offer those comments just as kind of, I guess, to augment, in effect, what you were saying to us. But we need to be kind of not completely lose touch with current reality and with the reasons that people own cars today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Driggs. We have Mr. Eggleston.
I want to start by thanking Mr. Driggs for the ringing endorsement and a significant investment in our transformational mobility network. I couldn't agree with him more. So thank you, Mr. Driggs.
Yeah, you're welcome. Glad to do it.
We'll put you down as a yes vote for that. The secondary impacts are certainly real, and there are a lot of situations where I agree with Mr. Winston that the market ought to determine what is needed. Most of those secondary impacts happen closer into the city, and so they're things that I hear about more often maybe than others. But I do think that an example like the one that we had sometime earlier this year, where there was a pledge essentially to Target that they were going to be asking people to pledge that they would not own a car. I think things like that, I'd like to see more of them. I hope that that works the way that we believe and hope that it will. One thing I'm wondering about is, as we look further away from the city, are we doing anything to try to encourage people towards, if they need lots of parking, and again, not because we're mandating it, but because they've determined that that is the need, are we doing anything to encourage structured parking as opposed to, a large sea of surface parking? Because we've talked a lot about stormwater lately. I'm thinking about places like Stonecrest, South Park Mall. South Park Mall actually has a mix of surface parking and structured parking, but structured parking obviously can be activated on the ground level. It can create the same number of parking spaces with less of a footprint. And is there a way that we can encourage people to go that route? If you go to Stonecrest, there's no structured parking that I'm aware of, and how many acres of surface parking lot that is impervious surface. So I feel like there's an opportunity there too, to kill a couple birds with one stone. It creates more opportunity for us to create pervious surface, if that's the opposite of impervious. And I know that the costs are greater, but I feel like there's probably a way that we could make that make sense for folks. And I think it just leads to better development. So I'm wondering if that's something we've considered in the areas where there is a determination that lots of spaces are needed.
That's a great question. We've looked at, I need to go back and see, and we can make sure that it's in there if it's not. But this may fly in the face of some of the other comments, but maybe not. Demand-wise, that maybe you could increase your maximum parking where you have a maximum if you do it in structured parking. So that might be a possibility of maybe incenting if people really do need more parking. They think the market is such that they need more parking, that we would not have quite as tight a cap if you did put that parking in structured parking.
That's a great segue for my question. Ms.
Can I
Hartman?
respond to that comment, Madam Chair?
Oh, sure, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, further to Mr. Winston's comments, the decision about structured parking is basically economic. You look at the cost of the land and you kind of run your numbers, and in some environments, as was the case in South Charlotte years ago, the cost of a structure is not justified in relation to the cost of the land. Now, we do have a situation in Valentine Village where we have a structured deck and we have surface parking near the shops. There can be hybrids, but I think if we wanted to materially drive towards the structured parking, and contrary to the economics, the market economics, we would have to be prepared to provide some kind of financial incentives or induce that. I don't know how we can impose that cost on people, and recognize too that our main priority here is to get cars off the road as opposed to the secondary concern about the impervious surface, which I acknowledge, but really what we're talking about mainly here is trying to get the cars out of town, off the road. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Eggleston.
Thanks. I meant to add one more thing, and I'll caveat this by saying I don't know a lot about this specific nuance, but I have read things that have made me wonder if we are encouraging, when structured parking is being built, whether we've encouraged it to be built that way or not, but when structured parking is being built, there have been other places where structured parking has been built in a way that essentially like the floor plates are flat or the heights between levels are such that in the future it could be repurposed without having to be demolished. And so as opposed to something where the entire deck is angled You're nodding like you know what I'm saying. Having the flat floor plates, having the certain floor heights, it is something that can be used for parking now and it could be used for something else later. Do we have anything as we're looking at the UDO that encourages that sort of potential for adaptive reuse down the road as we hope that our parking needs decrease over time?
Conversations with our private. Not to say that that's off the table. We did not put it in TOD because what we heard is the cost of doing that is so expensive that it's almost cheaper to deck down and rebuild what you really want on the site. Because we went pretty far on that topic and working that into TOD. So we don't have anything in this draft, but it's certainly something we can go back and look at again and test again with the folks who are more on the cost end of things.
Thank you. So my question is really that has to do with parking minimums, maximums in the former UMUD, which you're saying is now UC.
Yes.
You're saying there's no parking minimums and maximum parking limits apply. So I will need to know before I can really get on board with all of this parking discussion, what's going to change? And will we have a formula that demonstrates that while we admit if you're going to build 12 high rises in Uptown, you're going to have some additional parking, but overall, what's our total parking inventory in Uptown? And how are we managing it so that, unfortunately, it does become more expensive to park Uptown. The congestion is worse. And so we are moving people in the direction of wanting, when we make our investment in public transportation, that we get more people off the roads and to use public transportation. That's my concern, is that I just see us talking out of both sides of our mouths as a total community. I'm not just saying what you're presenting, Ms. Harmon, at all, but as a complete community, we can't have it both ways. And if we're going to get people to use public transportation because it gets people off the roads, then we can't keep making parking more available Uptown. So I don't know if you have that information right now, but how will this change in Tier 3, the parking that's allowed versus how it's written right now?
We can go back and get the specific numbers. Less parking would be allowed. Right now, we have no limit on how much parking you can build in our UMUD district. This would put a limit on it. And we also have a minimum right now that even in UMUD, as our current ordinance is written, that's in place now, you have to provide parking with your new building. We really thought of all places, this is a place where there's an opportunity to not require any parking. And this is a place where we have the greatest amount of transportation options. So we can get you the specific numbers as a point of comparison. But the change is right now there is a minimum and there's no maximum. And what this will do is eliminate the minimum and add a maximum.
I'm really happy to see that. So I appreciate that. And one other thing to think about is making the maximum, more restrictive, really. And if people want additional that goes beyond what the maximum is, they have to, there's a community benefit, I'll say it, that if you want more parking, then you pay into a fund that builds structured parking for the light rail somewhere else, or provides parking passes for students, or something that ties into our goals, not only for our transformational mobility network, but also for our CAP, and make sure that those two really are connected. So it's just something to think about. I don't know if that's really a UDO thing or not, but they certainly could be tied when we think about what that maximum uptown would be.
I was going to say that's, I don't want to speak for Ed McKinney's on, but we're working on our strategic mobility plan as well. And so that could be a place where we can address that in terms of mode share at the end of the day.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to want to see that before, hopefully it'll be in the draft.
Yes.
But at least the opportunity to talk about it will be there because I know that's important to me in moving forward to approve the UDO. Thank you. So, Mr. Newton has a question and then we'll move on.
Yes, I think it might be more of a comment. So seeing and considering this 3-tier approach for the first time, I actually like it. I think it has flexibility, which is what we want, particularly moving forward. Certainly, we want to get away from our car centricity. So being a car centric city, and I think that this is a step in the right direction. And maybe we continue to evolve as we review this in the future. I wanted to mention, so we're talking a lot about Tier 3, but I did want to mention my concern pertaining to eliminating minimums in Tier 1 and possibly even Tier 2. We have a very large, expansive, over 350 square mile city, one of the largest in the country for its expansiveness. And there are many areas that lack infrastructure and transportation options altogether. Public transportation just doesn't exist. Reedy Creek comes to mind. And I feel like that has created, for the folks and residents living in those areas, it's created a public safety risk. If you don't have you don't have public transportation, you don't have a sidewalk on very dangerous roads that are becoming more crowded. I just want us to be kind of cognizant of that. That is a concern of mine because I think that those are areas where we certainly want to provide that infrastructure and transportation over time. But seeing as how it doesn't exist today, unfortunately, cars are the reality, just not from the standpoint of people moving from point A to point B, but also from a standpoint of just public safety. So once again, this 3-tier approach is something that is appealing to me on first look here. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Newton. We're going to move on, but we're going backwards in the slides to a discussion we touched on last time. And Mr. Dioba is going to talk about this with regards to stormwater and natural resources.
Actually, I think it's Alison will start, and then that's why we have Mike Davis, Deputy Director.
Oh, thank you. Okay, Ms. Krager.
Yeah, so I've really wanted just to, for you to, Mayor Pro Tem, for you to ask your questions that you had about stormwater, because Mike is here today to help answer some of those questions that you provided to us. We don't necessarily have to go back to the slides if you don't want to. Or Mike, if you,
I can go ahead and paraphrase it.
Yeah,
Sure. So, first of all, it's good to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you guys. It's been a little while since we've talked about stormwater, and I think members of this committee have, in years past, spent a lot of time thinking about sort of what the capabilities of the program are, the challenges that we have with infrastructure. So really just wanted to come today to kind of take advantage of an opportunity to have a conversation. We don't have slides, but they're aware of concerns about how development, in particular, maybe infill development, is impacting the challenges we have in our drainage system. So what I want to do to try to tackle a question, which is really what is going on in terms of the UDO as it relates to Stormwater Services' ability to deal with its backlog. So what I would say is just to kind of step back at a very, very high level and think about why the UDO matters. What I would say is as we think about the challenges that we have faced with addressing repair needs around the city, there's really 3 things you can do to have any influence over what's going to happen over the long run. One is the scope of that work that we take on. And so you may recall from a couple of years ago, we did a lot of work to really think hard about what type of work we even choose to work on. And we've really focused that on public rights of way. The second thing you can do is really around just productivity of your capital program. And so you've seen budget updates from me over the last couple of years where over 5 years, we're really trying to accelerate the pace of work that we would do. And so by the end of those 5 years, we hope to be at a place of productivity that ends up being about 83% above what we had been doing prior to what we had embarked on with that 5-year plan. All that's kind of in the budget realm, and your question was about the UDO and its relationship. So the third thing you can really do in a program that's going to affect our long-term ability to manage the system is around development regulation. So those first two things I just described are how we take care of what's already been built. UDO really contemplates what's happening with new development. And so what I'll tell you at a high level is, for decades, Charlotte has benefited from pretty good regulation around storm drainage. But the pattern of growth that we have seen has been different than what it is now. So as large format subdivisions have come in, larger commercial developments, by and large, we have kept up with, the city has kept up with regulations to try to mitigate those impacts. In recent years, what we are seeing is smaller scale developments that are perhaps not triggering certain ordinances or falling between the cracks of certain processes. And the UDO really gives us a good opportunity to work on those gaps. So that's the high level. How does the UDO matter? Daryl Hammack is with me, and he's prepared to kind of do a similar high level, but kind of go a little deeper into what we do in terms of regulations and gaps. If you'd like for him to come up and talk about that a little bit, but from my view of the world, that's why the UDO matters, is so that as the drainage that is installed through new development gets put on the ground, we're not creating new issues that we're going to have to solve with our program that will hit the backlog later.
And while Joe comes up, I just have a question for you. And I know Mr. Winston does too. The anticipated changes in the General Assembly right now, how is that going to help or hinder you?
Yeah, thank you for that question too. So I'll mention two things. In 2018, our program took a big hit in terms of our ability to really adequately regulate. In 2018, we lost the ability to apply what's known as the post-construction stormwater ordinance to sites that are redeveloping, except in cases where they're adding impervious. The reason that matters is because sometimes we have situations where we know there's a problem today. Something could have been built a long time ago and have impacts. And really the best way to address it is as a site redevelops, and you can adequately accommodate that. That ability has been taken from us, and we would hope that that will one day be overturned. Second, to your question about what is sort of looming in the General Assembly right now, there's a budget provision that would contemplate that local government would not be able to have stormwater requirements that are beyond those established by federal and state. And that is potentially very consequential, because generally the way governments deal with drainage is at a local level. You're not going to have federal law and state law saying how to deal with the local impacts of development. So that's concerning to us, and would hope that that does not go through.
Is there a good effort underway to get that taken out?
My understanding is that there is certainly widespread concern across the state. I'm not an expert in reading the tea leaves on kind of how likely any one thing is in the legislature. We are working through Dana Fenton and are confident that there's a strong opposition mounted across the state to that.
And would it grandfather what's already in place, or would it remove the ordinances that we do have that are going?
My understanding is the immediate impact of it would be that any requirement that we would seek to put on any new development or redeveloping condition could not be in excess of state or federal. So the concept of grandfathering is not something that has come up.
Okay. So, and Joe, please feel free to come up. I just, as you know, my concern is the infill development and what it does to our existing properties in particular. And for years, we're seeing the change in weather in development patterns is causing concern for existing homeowners. So that's still going to be my concern.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here. I'm Daryl Hammack, Assistant Manager of Stormwater Services, and I just want to talk a little bit about our current regulatory process as it relates to plan reviews. Currently, we conduct drainage plan reviews for development sites that meet certain triggers. And one of those triggers is whether or not the development creates more than 20,000 square feet of impervious. That's about a half acre. That plan review evaluates on-site flood potential and requires stormwater control measures, these detention basins, these collection devices that detain and slowly release runoff to prevent downstream flooding. So that's our current process, but we do have some gaps in our process right now. As was mentioned, the drainage plan review threshold for sites now is sites that are greater than 20,000 square feet of impervious. We do not see the smaller infill types of developments. Those are not part of our process. So the nature today of development is, as you know, trending toward much smaller infill types of sites. So what we want to try to seek is a process to review those smaller infill sites, just as we do for the larger sites. And we don't have that now. So that's the first gap, is that we need to lower the threshold. A second gap is, as Mike mentioned, the change to state law. There's been a few changes afoot. And so a little bit of background, about 15 years ago, the development industry interests in Charlotte, the environmental interests, the city and Mecklenburg County all met together for 3 years to come up with a consensus agreement on a comprehensive stormwater management approach that balanced all of the local interests. But in December of 2018, state law changed, and it detrimentally affected our comprehensive approach and upset that balance. And what that did is it prohibited cities from regulating redevelopment sites. Okay, redevelopment sites may not be regulated as it relates to these stormwater control basins, these detention basins. So what that means in plain terms is that any currently developed site is allowed to rebuild without any form of stormwater control measure. So if there's a flooding problem or a surface water quality problem associated with that site as it exists currently, it's almost certainly going to continue after the site redevelops. So that's the second gap, and it relates to a so a couple things about closing some of our gaps. I mentioned main changes we're proposing is to reduce that threshold for a plan review from 20,000 square feet down to about 5,000 square feet of new impervious surface, new built upon area. And what that's going to do is slow the creation of downstream flooding problems that we often see with these smaller, tight, crammed in sites. The second change we're proposing is aimed at preventing the flooding problems on infill development. And so we're not going to get tangled up with what the state law prohibits us from doing, but we are going to focus on safely and responsibly conveying stormwater across these sites and away from these sites in a very thoughtful and deliberate way. So basically, to summarize, there's two proposals here aimed at preventing some costly public and costly private drainage problems that are very expensive and can be very costly to remediate after the fact.
Thank you, Joe. That's really interesting information. I think we should all bear these rules in mind when we look at our rezonings. Because I don't know, man, there's a strong lobby out there that's getting their way with stormwater, and it's hurting everybody. Mr. Winston, you have a question.
Yeah, again, it's another one of those. I'm not sure if it's a question, comment, or observation. Kind of tying in the last discussion that we had around parking and this idea around stormwater. It seems like there's an opportunity and that there's some type of correlation, a potential correlation. Like Mr. Eggleston brought up, right? The idea that surface level area parking creates much more impervious runoff than potentially structured parking. Thinking about growing up in New York City, the idea that, yeah, we do have people that park on all of the street, and you deal with part of those, driving around for 10, 15 minutes to find parking. Well, one of the things that you have there and why it is difficult is because you have alternate side of the street parking, right? And that's not just for revenue growth of the city. There are practical applications, right? When we think about stormwater, alternate side of the street is where you clean those sides of the street and you clear the storm drains. There's a stormwater impervious runoff connection there. When we think about rezonings and projects and I'm thinking of Central Square, how we're going from a big impervious space, and they're intentionally they're not going to clear all the parking away, but they're making it not just with their structure but with the surface parking more pervious by adding trees in certain areas. That rezoning that we had this week on Woodlawn and Selwyn, it actually added more pervious parking situation than before. Being that this is these are both such important issues in the UDO, is there an opportunity to maybe look at certain areas as we're making small area plans, for instance? If we know that there's going to be growth in certain parts of town that have certain types of specific stormwater issues, I'm thinking a lot in South Charlotte and things like that. Are there certain strategies that or stormwater requirements or issues relating to stormwater that we can tie into guidance in our policy making around parking, right? Because even if you do have more on-street parking, we have to think about how do we manage that from a stormwater? How do we get into those storm drains and clean those if cars are parked there 7 days a week, 50 days in a row? Is there a way that we can kind of connect these two so that they're working together towards goal and not kind of and make it make sense? You know what I'm saying? For these minimums, maximums, or whatever they may be, and so we're not running up into potential conflicts there.
Thank you.
Yeah, great thoughts. I'll just share a few of my reactions based on hearing those thoughts. I would start by saying, I mean, there are going to be challenges throughout the city. I don't know that we would isolate certain ones and say, here's where we've really got to think about how to make sure surface water is cleaner and being handled in terms of just conveying water. We face that challenge everywhere, and as drainage infrastructure deteriorates over time, we'll always need to be cleaning the water, maintaining those facilities. What that takes me to is there really is an opportunity with the UDO. Form-based code may be the wrong term here, but the more that we think about how compact development works as one cohesive thing, the further we get to advance our goals. So we're glad to be at the table with planning and others trying to treat it as one set of development regulations, not a patchwork of different ones. And then I guess the last point I want to make is I do think that there are clear benefits in reducing the amount of impervious area, because at the end of the day, the runoff that we're dealing with comes from the fact that rain is hitting pervious surfaces and it's washing into creeks. That said, what we care more about is at the end of the day, when that development is done, do we have the adequate design, the allowance for the space and the devices that are necessary to slowly release that water? So that can be to drain into the ground. It can be to be held in detention basins, and then ultimately, finding its way to creeks. If we get the design right, it can work with structured parking. It can work with surface parking. So I don't want to take a position that says one is better than the other, but it is very clear the more impervious you have, the more of a challenge you will have to solve your stormwater issues. But where we fall on that issue is as long as you take care of it on the development site and aren't burdening the downstream property owners and are not sending an excess amount of dirty water into the creeks, we don't care how you got there.
Okay, thank you both for being here to address this, and I'm glad to see that you're going to have the opportunity to put it into the UDO. We are moving on to the Center City 2040 plan.
Madam Chair,
okay, Mr. Driggs.
Thank you. I did want to point out, following our conversation in the zoning meeting, that you made reference to the $1 billion backlog, and I think it's worth noting that we did pare that down a lot, and it was done in part by just filtering stale requests for service. We had the plan, and Mr. Davis, correct me if I'm wrong, but we had a plan where we offered over a certain finite period of time, that people who have C requests, low priority requests, could get city assistance in dealing with their issues. But if they didn't avail themselves of that, then they would be dropped. So no one was kind of kicked out that had a serious problem. And it was also, I think, clear from the review process that a number of even the higher priority cases didn't really call for action. We had some in the Bs that were very stale also. So I think we had a process for paring down, but also, as Mr. Davis has pointed out, we have made significant progress in dealing with the remaining applications. So I just think that's a big success. I wanted to point it out. It doesn't mean in my mind that the problem is solved or that any of the concerns that you have raised require any less attention from us. I also wanted to say that in my mind, the stormwater system that we have right now is actually good. So I agree with the suggestion that what we need maybe are changes in parameters, and rather than a complete rethink of how we do this, that requirement is tough. And I think we take it very seriously. The inspections are good. There are situations where, in fact, the runoff onto neighboring properties is improved by development and by new developments' conformance with the stormwater regulations. So I've had situations where neighbors next door said, hey, I've got a problem with flooding from that site, and that got fixed. A couple of questions though, and by the way, to the point that was made about the mitigation, redevelopment mitigation, one circumstance we need to be sensitive to is you could have something like an old dirty parking lot. And if you impose tough requirements, any redevelopment of that lot, including the cost of removing what's there and implementing the new requirements, could be kind of prohibitive. And then what happens is, instead of getting a better situation than the parking lot, you continue to have the parking lot. So I think as we consider these things, we need to have some room for the circumstances where a thing is improved over what it was, even if it's not everything that we would want, just to allow something to happen. I did have a question for Mike and Mr. Hammack about the two features of our current stormwater are the fee in lieu, which has seen very little use. So are we intending through the UDO to modify how that particular thing works? And then in the same context, we also have a bonus that we provide for people that implement special stormwater mitigation, and would that change?
Thank you, Mr. Driggs. I want to point out that the mitigation fee was a very, very highly successful program for many years. But in 2018, when the state changed their approach to allowing cities to make requirements on redeveloping properties, that fee essentially went away. There were no more fees that needed to be paid for a redeveloping site, and there was no mitigation. So the city had been taking that money and investing it throughout the system to improve conditions. And so it was very much helping the city's surface water quality problems and the city's flooding problems, but that tool went away, which is why I mentioned earlier that the balance is very terribly off right now. And I think you had a second question there. And
the bonus, there's a bonus, if I recall correctly, for special mitigation measures being taken in redeveloped sites. Is that right?
So I think right now the situation is there are no bonuses. It's that redeveloping sites have very, very few stormwater requirements, and so there it's essentially a bonus already. So.
But I'm remembering that right? I thought there was a special provision that said if you put in certain extraordinary mitigation features that you could have more impervious. Is that wrong?
So part of the agreement that was reached some years ago did provide additional flexibility and additional options for developers. But again, as it relates to redevelopment, that has gone away. There may still be some density bonuses for new development sites, greenfield development. And those still exist.
And finally, Madam Chair, I have two things for my learned colleague, Mr. Eggleston. For one, I am not committing at this time to vote for the mobility plan. But the second one is, I believe you're on the board of the League of Municipalities, and it seems that they ought to be right in the middle of these discussions, because I'm assuming that the state law does not provide kind of various detailed provisions by community, i.e. the stormwater situation varies a lot from place to place around the state. And unless they have a structure that reflects that, the idea of treating one size fits all is very punitive for cities. So I'm just wondering how the league is engaged on this, and whether we can gain more autonomy for cities, which I fought for when I was on the board there. That's for Mr. Eggleston.
I agree wholeheartedly on your second point. We'll debate your first on offline, but the league is, as you know, having served on it for several years yourself, always in favor of more local control. And so I know it's something they're constantly advocating for on all fronts. I agree with you that for us to be operating under the same guidelines as areas that aren't seeing the level of development we are, or in some cases hardly any development, is a square peg for a round hole. So I know they're engaged in those conversations. I can try to dig in more to see what specifically they've been conversing with folks on lately as it relates to things like stormwater specifically.
Because this could be seen as a big city problem, and the league, of course, represents 500 or whatever it is municipalities. So we may need to make a noise to get them to really take it up, but that would be a valuable source of advocacy on this point. Thank you.
I think that as it relates to stormwater and things like that, obviously the streams and rivers and things whose health are impacted by these run through every community in our state. So certainly water runs downhill, and that's urban and rural. And I would think that the problems we're having here are impacting places that are not seeing the same levels of development we are. So it should be a shared interest.
Well, and what I've heard from other council members and commissioners around the state that we have to bear in mind is some of these towns are really small. And when you have a stormwater repair issue and you don't have the right to have local ordinances or whatnot, it hits your budget in a much bigger way too. So I think the size has a lot to do with it as well. Okay, Mr. Newton, do you still have a question?
Yes, I do. I have two. So as we move away from our conversation regarding the UDO, my first question is stormwater related, and admittedly, I don't think I'm as well versed on these new stormwater regulations as everyone else. So I might be a little off base here with this question. But I was just wondering if there were regulations pertaining to grade. So if we have new development occurring at a higher grade than, say, surrounding existing developments, that could potentially create a stormwater issue, a more impervious surface. And I just didn't know if we had, maybe this is something we've discussed before, and so maybe I missed it, but I didn't know if that was, so these, grade levels, I suppose, higher, a land that sits higher than surrounding areas, if that has been taken into consideration. And then my second point, before I forget this, so I guess my second question, once again, as we're moving away from our UDO conversation, the UDO itself should streamline the rezoning process. And I would assume that there would be cost associated with that. So maybe some losses on our end. Certainly, I think, some benefits that we would like to see in kind of the expediency of the type of development we want to encourage. But I'm just wondering what those costs on our end is. And frankly, maybe on the other side of things, what the savings are for the development community. And didn't know if that was something that is maybe in the works, where we're maybe going to see a breakdown of those costs. But I did want to ask about that too, and maybe put it on everyone's radar, particularly our planning department radar, something maybe to pursue offline, but just wanted to get that out there. If we could get some more information on what those impacts, seeing as how we have, we're going to enter into this more streamlined process, what those cost impacts would be. But anyhow, back to that first point or first question, this idea of grade, is that taken into consideration here?
So let me take a swing at that and see if this answers your question. There wouldn't be anything about our regulation that would say because you're at a certain elevation, there's different requirements. But perhaps what gets close to that is if you're in a very low-lying area, you're likely developing around larger stream systems that do have various kinds of buffers and things that ensure that those stream systems are protected. So it's not related to grade, but maybe it is indirectly. The other thought I have around that question is it's certainly true that development that is sitting at the top of a hill in terms of the overall topography is having an impact all the way between it and wherever it finally meets up with the stream. And so just as development plans are reviewed and it's tying into those drainage systems, its impact is considered against that and the entirety of that drainage system that's trying to convey that. But you don't find that there are different requirements by grade. So the second question is around cost. And I'm glad that what you, yeah, sure.
Can I just ask a question? Just because, Mr. Newton, would it be okay on that? Because that's a big question. And it would be one that all council members would want info on. And we are running about 15 minutes behind. Would that be okay if Mike, if you all came back with that information for everybody and shared it with everyone?
Are you referring to the cost?
The costs, expense?
Yeah, really what I was gonna say, we would probably work with planning on that,
Okay.
not do it in isolation.
That
I
would be
was gonna
great.
say, we have a plan to come to council on October 11 with the UDO update. That may be a very good one to address at that time.
Yeah, because it is an important question. I'm sure everybody will want information on. Thank you both for being here today. You guys have a tough job. It's a really critical issue. As Mr. Driggs said, you've done a great job of getting into that backlog and cleaning it up. There's so much more, and I hope that you will let council know that when it's a matter of resources or whatever it is, because it's a critical issue. So thank you. The next, we are going to go to, and I'll turn this over to Taiwo first, but we do have Michael Smith here, I believe, with Center City Partners. I don't see him quite yet, but for a follow-up on the conversation on the Center City's 24 vision plan presentation from the last meeting.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I know we've taken some time, so I'm just going to yield to Michael. But I do know that this went to the planning committee of the Planning Commission yesterday, and they had a very good conversation. I think it went well. It's going to go back to them in another month. But Michael will kind of give you details of where we are. Like we did with the UDO, this is really more of a follow-up on the previous conversation we had with you last month. And thank you for setting up this special committee meeting to be able to further address some of the questions that you may have. Thank you. Michael?
Thank you, Ty. It's a pleasure to be back with all of you. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem and members of the committee. I'll remind you that the Center City Plan is intended to provide a bold, big picture. This is not Center City Partners' plan. We are proud to work with the city and the planning department and with Mecklenburg County, and for us to jointly fund this. This has been the model that we've used for decades, all the way back to the 1966 Odell Plan. It's a 160-page document that you've all viewed. It reflects the community's ideas, what they've told us is important to them, and the kind of place that they aspire for the middle of their region to become and be of service to them. And even though vision plans are high policy or high level policy, there are some distinct strategies, projects, and programs that are within this that help us achieve these community goals. And as the economic engine for the region, Center City is uniquely poised to be a real asset to our community. I feel like there's a handful of things that give our community superpower: our airport, our environment, our Center City. And it is such a great revenue creator that allows us to invest in the priorities of our entire community because of its strength and vibrancy. Next slide, please. If we could go a couple down. One more. Yes, thank you. Perfect. So Charlotte Mecklenburg has this legacy of visionary planning, and it's really contributed to the community's recipe for success. We also enjoy an incredible tailwind at our backs. And A lot has changed over the last decade. You look at the census results and you really see all the new families and all the new ideas and opportunities and challenges that come to our community. And this is a chance for us to look with fresh eyes and think about what we want to take on next. So there's been a lot of listening. And even though our past plans have been rooted in community values, not everyone has benefited from the growth. And we've learned that we can't solely count on free market activities to meet our commitment to equity. And we need to focus on being more purposeful, inclusive, and intentional about our growth and the way we shape it. It's for that reason that the approach to this plan is different than past. And this vision plan we'll be discussing further today looks to take on our challenges head on. We think this plan will be remembered for its commitment to equity in decision-making and investment, its commitment to building out and improving our mobility network and all that that means for our community, and supporting the maturation of our center city neighborhoods beyond Uptown, beyond the CBD, to be complete places. Next slide, please. To remind you, it's a 2-mile radius is the project plan. One more slide, please. Thank you. So it's roughly 2 miles. Next slide, please. The draft project plan was released on July 23rd, which began a 7-week public review process and ended on September 30th. During this time, the plan was publicized through many methods and channels, multimedia publications, direct mail to the 500 community members who signed up for continued information and updates, social media posts. We kept 11 hard copies, one at each of the district libraries throughout the community. And the team has also met with various community and stakeholder groups to go out and listen intentionally. It's advocates like the Northwest Corridor Council of Elders, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg climate leaders, the planning commissioners, and various groups like that. Next slide, please. Since releasing the plan, the project team has also sent invitations to neighborhood leaders, just continuing to reach out. You just can't do enough listening, particularly during this period while the plan is written in pencil and can be recast. It's allowed us to collect 700 points of input, including 200 comments and suggestions. The comments and ideas received have been primarily focused on issues of transportation and sustainability, particularly the need to invest in alternative modes of travel to help our community mature beyond single occupancy vehicle trips. There's been a strong desire for more parks and public space, with a lot of passion for the idea about Queens Park. And then confirming calls for complete communities. This idea that is so fundamental to the UDO of 10-minute neighborhoods throughout the center city and throughout the city as a whole. These neighborhoods in our urban core really offer some of the best opportunities to be able to meet this challenge. Now I'd like to turn it over to our partner in this process, Grant Miacci, with the Planning Department, who will highlight some of the comments and input we've been hearing from the community, and we look forward to addressing some of your questions. Grant?
Sure, thanks, Michael. We reminded the community and really everyone when we released this draft plan that we're not finished yet. We continue to get feedback, ideas that we hadn't thought of during this process. So what I would like to do is really walk through a summary of, just as a conversation starter, of things in the plan that people liked, some of the things we missed, and new ideas that we didn't think of. So, in terms of what people really resonated with in the plan, the investment that we've made in bike and pedestrian connectivity in Center City is something that people have enjoyed and continue to want to see that investment, and that we should keep doing that. They love the idea of this interconnected, system of parks and open spaces, and how we can leverage that through the Cross Charlotte Trail and other trail connections as well. And that, urban density in the center city is a good thing, and it helps drive, hopefully drive the cost of living down, and certainly an increase in the types of housing that's available as well. So in terms of focus areas, who doesn't love the idea of Queens Park, transforming, that rail yard? We know it's a long-term goal, and it'll take a lot of different partners to make happen, but something that has really resonated. They like the idea of prioritizing investment where we have historically not done so as much. So West End, historic West End, and the North End. And even, limiting the expansion of some of our more interior focused retail in Uptown. It's currently right now in the River Street Mall, which I haven't been in a year and a half, so I assume it's still there. But really forcing more the ability for us to really have a vibrant pedestrian activity in Uptown. Next slide. So what we heard needs work, and you all just talked about that in the UDO. There's really too much, this idea there's too much parking being provided in Uptown and South End. So how do we find that balance between what was a healthy conversation about what the market needs and how parking affects the physical environment of our center city? There's some great sustainability goals in the plan, but we really need to talk a little bit more about recommendations that address the heat island effect, not only just in our central business district, but in neighborhoods as well. Are we able to advocate more strongly for sale housing in Uptown, where the majority of the development that we've seen in the last 10 years has been rental? And then how do we address, the concept of safety while helping, our homeless residents and reducing the need to kind of panhandle as well? So how that translates to some of the focus areas is, without having a kind of healthy kind of shopping and service and retail experience, that vibrancy that we all really hope for in Center City is an uphill battle. We need some specificity on how do we improve on what's next after the epicenter. It's an important block in Uptown, and certainly adjacent to what will be a really transformative project and redevelopment of the CTC. And then how do we address, as we continue to build out the Gold Line in phase 3, how do we address the pedestrian environment, particularly as we talk about getting north of Brookshire and Highway 16, and make sure that that connectivity from the last stop on the north, on the west side, that pedestrian environment along that corridor is really safe and easy for people to travel. Next slide. And then, a few new ideas that have come up. We had a few folks who called for either free or drastically reduced pricing for public transportation, particularly within Route 4. And one example, a comment was, creating a fare-free transit zone within Route 4. That certainly we'll need to coordinate and talk to our colleagues at CATS to see how that ties into some of their mobility recommendations with the bus network. Another idea that you may have seen and read about, probably most famously in Vancouver, is requiring multifamily development to include child care facilities. And that not only our sustainability goals aren't limited to the performance of buildings and landscapes after they are built, but actually while they are constructed. So is there and can there be requirements for new Center City construction to promote clean and sustainable construction methods as well? In terms of focus areas, you know, the idea of having Second Ward High School be a priority resonated very well, folks. But should there actually be a partnership with community college to kind of expand on trades training in addition to the kind of corporate partnerships and programs that we spoke about in the plan? And then, you know, something that's probably low-hanging fruit for us is really kind of expanding the idea of street vendor programs and pop-up shops beyond Tryon Street. And a great discussion last night at Planning Committee about how that might lower the barrier to entry to many new businesses that don't have the ability to kind of and visibility that Center City has in terms of retail and commercial environment. So next slide. So next slide after that, please. So we're just at the Planning Committee. Will be back again in October, hopefully with the revisions that they would like to see and that we've heard from other community members. Preferably they'd have a referral to public hearing. Then we would also be back in front of you again after this conversation, making those revisions. And in October also meeting with the CMS School Board, and ultimately in November, being in front of full council with both a public hearing and an adoption, and also in front of the Board of County Commissioners for endorsement. So, Michael, I think that was the last bit that I had before we open it up for the discussion. Anything else?
Yeah, just I would reiterate that we're humbled to be a part of this process with all of you and with the city staff and the county staff. And we're often reminded that what an incredible city we would be passing on to the next generation if we were able to accomplish this vision and act on its values as laid out in this plan. And we're thrilled to be with you and look forward to your questions and working with you.
Thank you, Michael and Grant. We appreciate the presentation, kind of the overview again, so we can get into some of the questions that council members had. I'll start with Mr. Eggleston.
Thank you. I'm glad to see a couple of things that we talked about last time reflected in the updated presentation. So thank you for hearing us on those. Two things, and these aren't necessarily a charge to those leading the effort on this plan, but I think you've identified a couple of things that we internally here at this city staff need to be keeping top of mind, one of which we've talked about a good bit, the Queens Park piece. If this is a plan that council is going to endorse, and in the I like it slide in a focus area, we talk about the strong response people are having to Queens Park. And there are impediments to Queens Park that are out of our control as it relates to the railroads, but bless you. One potential impediment that's not out of our control is the continued discussion of expansion of the maintenance facility for cats. And so I think if this is something we believe in, we've got to get ahead of that. We can't be, if the railroads are the reason that Queens Park doesn't come together the way that it's envisioned, it is what it is. If the city is the reason it doesn't come together the way it's envisioned, then I think we've dropped the ball. So that's more of a charge to our staff here to figure out what alternatives are that wouldn't impede the progress there as it relates to the CATS maintenance facility. One thing that was on here that was interesting, it seems kind of granular, but I don't think it is. The needs work, I was surprised to see, but pleasantly surprised that we've identified this as a problem. Need to address pedestrian environment on Beatties Ford Road or Beatties Ford Bridge over Highway 16. And it's obviously right there at our Vest water plant where the Excelsior Club was, and the terminus, the western terminus of the Gold Line streetcar phase 2. And there is a great need there. The other thing that it brought to mind for me that I kind of shamefully hadn't thought of lately was there used to be a pedestrian bridge that went over 77 from that same area to the north end to kind of the Double Oaks Bright Walk general vicinity. And as the construction was done to add the managed lanes to 77, that was removed and never replaced. And I don't know, I presume there's no intention to replace it. But we've talked about ad nauseum how we've used highways in a different era to split communities in half. 77 certainly did that. We're not going to undo that by removing 77, but we can, I think, bandage those wounds with effective connection points. I think we've done a good job making the Trade Street Beatties Ford corridor under 77. We're turning that into a plaza, making that much more inviting and walkable. The streetcar, I think, is going to do that. I think this identification of a need to improve the bridge of Beatties Ford over 16 can do that. But I think we ought to be talking to folks at NCDOT too about how in certain circumstances we are able to create pedestrian bridges over interstates where it's safe and where it's possible to give folks connection points, because there are people who might live, as the crow flies, not far at all from a lot of the amenities that are available in the north end. But because of I-77, they have no good option in terms of how they would get there on foot or on a bike. So I'm glad to see that addressed in here. And I think that it maybe speaks to a broader need where there are more opportunities than just the Beatties Ford 16 bridge, but I think that is certainly one of them. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Newton and then Mr. Driggs.
Thank you. So I had two questions. The first is, I guess they're both pertaining to transportation. The first is a question regarding parking. I noticed within the presentation that there was a comment pertaining to too much parking in the uptown area, and I was just wondering, building upon the conversation we just had regarding the UDO, what parking maximums are there included within this plan? We're talking about, so as I understand it, a plan that will extend out 20 years, and we may be, I suspect we'll be instituting, within that 3-tier approach that we were discussing under the UDO, we might be instituting maximums regardless. Would it make sense? I think it would actually make sense to have some consistency here between the UDO and our conversations and the possibility of parking maximums within this plan. And I just wanted to ask about that. What are they? Are they even present altogether within the plan? And then the second question I have pertaining to mode share of transportation. Within our strategic mobility plan, it's my understanding that we are seeking a 50-50 goal, so a split between cars and other modes of transportation throughout the city. Now, this is district specific, as I understand it as well, meaning that that's not a goal that is being instituted. So the true 50-50 not instituted in all areas of the city, but certainly there will be areas where we need to make up the difference. And I feel like Uptown will be one of those areas where we would need to have less car mode share or motor vehicle mode share, frankly, well below 50%. And I just wanted to ask if that is addressed in the plan as well. So first question pertaining to parking maximum, second question pertaining to that mode share, and whether the plan reflects less than 50% mode share for motor vehicles.
Grant, why don't you and I ham and egg this, and I'm glad to start.
Can I be the egg since I'm vegetarian?
Yes.
Okay.
And eggs, though. Sorry. So Councilman, I think it's a great question. The plan is very committed to, I think you're correct that the center city is one of our greatest opportunities to act in a sustainable way. It creates a place where there can be a no park per day or a park once kind of day where you're able to then walk to everything you need or bike or transit in. And that's the power of our urban places throughout all civilization. The plan calls for our center city becoming more sustainable, more resilient, more low carbon. It talks about improving mode share, but does not set a specific goal. And the thinking behind it was that we would do that specifically in the transportation plan that the city and city council is working on. I'm being encouraged more and more to maybe set a goal for our center city regarding mode share. And I'd like to talk more with Grant and with CDOT about that and for us to evaluate that, because this is a vision plan. It's not going to describe how to do it, because that's the policy work that's done at a more granular level, either through your policy or through specific additional planning. So regarding mode share, that's where that is, but I think it's something we should continue to evaluate. And then back to your first question on whether or not this sets a parking maximum. And what the plan says right now on page 58, 2D2, is it recommends that we eliminate parking minimums in the center city, and that as the city and region build out its comprehensive transit system, its bike network, that we return and reevaluate parking maximums. I think putting parking maximums in right now will have massive unintended consequences that could have issues around equity, around people being able to get to work, and it could disrupt our centralized employment that's at the middle of our transit system. And it could have real negative consequences. And I think we need to be careful, because I guarantee that there is no developer that comes to our city that builds excess parking. They are building it, in connection to either what is demanded by their customer base or is required to get the financing that they need.
And maybe we can talk more about it offline. I just want to make sure that as we move forward with our own policy as a city, that there is consistency between our policy and this plan. And I do like what you were saying, Michael, which is there should be some coordination between your organization and our city staff to make sure that consistency exists. So I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Too.
If I can just jump in on that for a second. Michael, did the consultants carve out some of their work specifically for dealing with the parking questions?
Yes. MEG did look at our transportation system, and part of their analysis was these recommendations about how we're handling parking as a part of that ecosystem.
So that's just how to enable parking. But I guess, and maybe this is a question for Taiwo, is anybody doing a comprehensive analysis of what parking is needed? So not to say how to bring parking, but what parking is needed, and lining it up with our transformational mobility network, the time frame, if we are to get funding or not, because I do think that is an important point.
Not one that I'm aware of, but probably Liz and Ed can speak more to that. But what I'm hearing from you is someone who can assess the inventory. I think someone mentioned that earlier, and then what we need.
Yeah, I think it really,
before we come up with
right.
decisions around.
I think we need a comprehensive study of mobility and parking uptown growth in other modes, multimodal modes. But we just are sort of dancing around this issue and kind of talking in silos about parking uptown and what's really needed into the future vis-a-vis our projected growth and vis-a-vis our goals for public transportation.
I think there was the study that Kim Lehan did. Liz or Ed, if you want to jump in on that, but I'm not sure it addressed that parking issue.
This is Ed McKinney with CDOT. We don't have a specific study that's answering some of the questions that you're raising here, so that's something we'll have to consider with information with Center City partners.
Do you see a need for it?
For sure, I think for sure in the context of the conversation that we've been having all afternoon, even earlier relative to the UDO, I think that the changes that I think are being suggested and are going to be considered as part of the transition of the UMUD zoning district to the new urban center zoning district. There are specific things that are anticipated to go into those regulations that will probably need further consideration. So that may be another next step for us to have a little bit deeper conversation with planning and Center City on the process and implementation of some of those recommendations in the UDO.
Okay.
We would welcome this. And I think what it would allow us to do is understand some of the nuances of, the kind of uses for land, the different land uses, and also looking within different parts of the Center City and how like each walk shed is currently served. Because, I think a lot of thinking should go into what is immediately adjacent to transit uses, what is immediately adjacent to big public uses, and where is it already adequately served with public parking and private parking.
Yeah, I personally think it would be helpful. I think some of my colleagues would agree with me. When we had like 7th and North Tryon, some of us were really blindsided with that request to contribute to an underground parking garage. And we don't have anything to compare it to what the need is. So I'm not saying, we should go in and say no, but we need information. We need to know what the plan is. I mean, even if you talk about existing parking, it kind of feels like a lot of the parking inventory is on the wrong side of Uptown right now. It's all off towards 10th, 11th Street, 7th Street on. There's a lot of parking decks, but the activity's all happening at 3rd and 4th Street, for example, on a Saturday night. So I just feel like we need some guidelines. We need some help in looking into the future as to what we need for parking and where it should go and how it works into our future plans. That's the end of my story. I think Mr. Driggs had a question next. Oh, he's not there. Okay.
He's wearing camouflage.
I got Mr. Yeah. He's one big green screen. Does any other committee members have questions? Mr. Winston.
I got a lot of my questions in about this the last time, so that's why I don't have so many now. But wondering what the plan says for the area in First Ward, particularly kind of up and down Brevard, Caldwell, starting from UNC Charlotte, kind of on down to Spectrum Arena, and that parking deck that is complete but is not being utilized at all. What does the 2040 plan envision managing the growth of uptown area, Center City area, along that route?
So, Grant, do you want to go first? Then I'll jump in as well.
Sure. So, Mr. Winston, I think the majority of that area was really contemplated in the Silver Line, Blue Line crossing, and that kind of transformational mobility that will happen at that, and how that will influence that kind of corridor between, you know, a lower density fourth ward and a lower density first ward as well. So we see that, and I would say in conjunction with kind of re-envisioning what the government district kind of looks like. That's really the influences on that particular area. So to put it, you know, bluntly, there'll be the opportunity to leverage TOD in Uptown won't be any greater than at the confluence of the silver and blue lines, Al Marshall and those blocks south in particular.
It's an unmatched opportunity for our community to act on its values in the CBD, because it will create so much value. And we have almost 4 blocks that are owned by Mecklenburg County. And if we do it right, it becomes also a real bridge for vibrancy to spring across 277 into the north end. And there's a lot of specificity about our community's aspirations for this area in the North Tryon Plan, which was adopted by City Council 4 or 5 years ago.
I guess one thing I was thinking about this weekend, in context to a story that came out about uptown traffic, and managing people during special events, particularly Panthers games and college football games and so on and so forth. And I kind of wanted to think a little higher level about the culture, right? The culture, a big part of this is why it takes so much person power to manage this, is that we do have these cars that are coming in from many different directions that are converging on Uptown, right? And a big part of that is because of the tailgating culture, this, that, and the other. And I think that's probably one of also the reasons why certain surface area parking lots remain, right? These are business models that have existed for a long time. There's a cultural kind of dynamic of this. You know, as we kind of continue to build around public transportation, I wonder, and Uptown becomes more congested over time as it grows, I wonder if cultures might not change, right? Might change if those surface areas, parking lots, for instance, go away and there aren't as many tailgating opportunities. Do those opportunities move to different parts of Charlotte, right? Like you could foresee, for instance, people that are coming from the north, maybe stopping at the University City area, tailgating out there, taking in Top Golf and riding the train on down into the game uptown, or vice versa, coming from a different route. Or maybe there's some type of people mover that gets people from the airport to Uptown for these activities. Have we thought about that as we're changing? How does the Center City area kind of interact from a mobility standpoint, from a congestion standpoint, not just in the immediate surrounding areas, but some of those places that Center City might be particularly hot wired to over the next 20 to 30 years, as it becomes really a central node to that kind of multimodal transportation option? It might be some type of way we think about it, moving people and from a different cultural perspective. You know, is that something that we're thinking about or accounting for in this kind of plan?
Councilman, I don't know of a bigger move that our city government has made than its investments in transit during the last 20 years. And it is amazing the way it has stimulated and shaped private investment and just the way we all enjoy things. I'll never forget walking what is now Romare Bearden Park with Danny Morrison, who was then president of the Panthers, and that was the hottest spot to tailgate. And you know, we've seen that transformation, and you know, our fan base adapted. I think we also find it in many of the patterns. The investment that we are all making in the Gateway Station is going to be this incredible bridge between West Charlotte and up at the top of the hill and uptown. And we're already seeing the private sector adapting. It will be an incredible employment center that sprouts around that and will extend non-car oriented transit patterns where people will be able to land, much like the Citibank Tower in Chicago, where you get off the train and you just get on the elevator and you're at work.
Thank you. Mr. Driggs is back. You had a question, Mr. Driggs?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to acknowledge first that I came down pretty hard last time, and I apologize for that. I should have shown more appreciation for the work that went into the plan. My concern was mainly that, having spent 4 years at least, as Mr. McKinney can attest, participating in the evolution of the idea of place types and the formulation of this plan, which was a bumpy and pretty arduous road. When considering this plan, if I'm being told as if it was a new idea about our goals for air quality and stuff like that, I have to think, well, we've done that. So my view of this plan is that it is let's call it a sort of satellite to the 2040 plan that is specifically addresses the circumstances within the target area. And I think it's valuable. It's important that we do that. We need to recognize what general provisions in the 2040 plan may not be applicable to the special circumstances in your service area there, in the area that you worked on. And therefore, I will look at this plan in terms of maybe what it implies for the 2040 plan. What do we need to do in the 2040 plan as we go to work it out in greater detail in order to be responsive to some of the issues in your plan? Or which things in your plan align anyway, and can we adopt, without further? And I guess that's a question to you, Michael. Do you see things in the 2040 plan that are not compatible with the goals that you've established for the district that you're talking about?
There's none that jump to mind. The only one that we're watching very carefully that is not like in the 2040 plan. No, I think there's great alignment. We intentionally retained the same consulting firm so that both plans were informed by all community input and that we could create great alignment. And I think that was Taiwo's recommendation. I think it served us incredibly well. The issue of parking maximums is the one that is going to be resolved through UDO, and that's still being discussed in for the final version of the Center City Vision Plan. And that's one that I want to make sure that we get all voices to the table so that we get something that is represented, that can be implemented, and that doesn't have huge unintended consequences.
That would certainly be one of the areas in my mind where Uptown is very different from my district, for example. And we heard earlier about the proposed provisions for parking, the minimums, the maximums, things like that. And I think there are issues on both sides. The points I made there, which some of my colleagues have heard, but we can't get too far ahead of reality, of the current reality with our parking requirements. Because if we're out of step with the number of people who actually own cars, we're going to have a mess uptown. We're going to have extremely expensive paid parking. We're going to have people parking in bad places out of desperation. So, I hope we'll be clear about the special situation uptown as we go to finalize the 2040 plan's parking requirements. There could be issues in my mind in Fourth Ward about the 2.1 provisions. And we talked earlier about how we would have historic neighborhoods protected. And I think that would be an ideal area to kind of create an overlay of some kind. And it's neighborhood character overlay, so it's not necessarily that it qualifies for the historic, which it may as well. But there are, in fact, in the uptown area, in the area that you talked about, there are some cases where our infill and the neighborhood character overlays could be applicable. So, or where there might be special circumstances that would apply to those in your area as opposed to the remainder of Charlotte. So I'll be looking, reviewing the plan again, to resolve in my own mind where it doesn't necessarily line up. And I appreciate the progress that we've made to this point. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no other questions from the committee, Michael, thank you very much for coming back and being willing to answer everybody's questions. We know this is a visionary plan. There's some great things in here. As I mentioned to you before, I'm excited about including Second Ward in any conversations as to what can be. I hope Queen City Park can really figure out a solution, that and Epicenter, because they're, there's some great ideas for the park. Maybe we can figure out a Highline type solution. I don't know, but thank you for the vision and for addressing our questions. If there's nothing else, Taiwo has something.
Yes, thank you very much. I just want to say thanks to all of you for taking time to sit down for almost 3 hours. But these two projects are very important, and we really appreciate you doing this. I'll just remind you of a couple of dates. The week of October 4 is when we released the draft of the Unified Development Ordinance. If you remember the presentation that Tony Lathrop and Allison did to Council a couple weeks ago, kind of gave you a snapshot of the work that the Ordinance Advisory Council has been doing, as well as staff, to get us to this point. So something to look forward to. And then the following week is when we will have the draft policy map out, also for review. The next week, when we meet at TAP again, we're going to share with you preliminary findings from the fiscal impact analysis that's related to the comprehensive plan. That's when you see some preliminary findings related to the likeliness of duplexes, triplexes. And we will set up meetings to do deeper dive with you after that, but we want to make sure that we share that with you because we just got those findings this week and we want to quickly share those with you and get your input before we move further. And then that same meeting, you're going to hear about economic analysis of the Silver Line, of 11th versus 7th Street stations. And then subsequently, once the first draft of the Unified Development Ordinance is out, we will conduct another economic analysis of the regulations associated with the UDO. So the question that Councilman Newton asked about costs, some of those will be in that. But when we come to council on October 11, we'll give you some ideas what we're looking at in terms of that economic analysis, what that will entail. So just wanted to throw those in there. I know that's a lot, but I'm looking forward to reflecting some of what we heard from you today on the UDO in that first draft that you will see when it comes out early October. Thank you once again.
Thanks, Taiwo. And thank you, staff. This was great. I appreciate the opportunity to get our questions answered. With that, I will take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.